Fine.
Already.
Okay, well, thank you very much for having me. It's good to see so many people in a chapter joining. Been having trouble getting some of the chapters to respond, so it's good to see a lot of you here. As Jonathan mentioned, I'm going to be talking about dose reconstruction programs. At first, I'll talk in general about dose reconstruction, and then I'll move on to specifically the Energy Employees Occupational Illness Compensation Act, and then primarily talk about internal dosimetry because that's what I do on the project. There are a lot of facets to the dose reconstruction program. So the part that I talk about is just one small part of the overall, many pieces of it. So I will warn you, I had my husband, who's a nuclear engineer, watch one of the recordings that I did earlier for another chapter, just to see if he could give me some pointers on making sure that it flowed okay. And told me it was a dry subject, and mostly it was dry because I was boring, apparently. I will try not to be boring. I am the principal scientist for internal dosimetry for the contractor team. So NIOSH is the group that is the analytical support, and they have subcontracted to our team to do a lot of the dose reconstruction work. Generally, I just make sure that people are doing dose reconstructions consistently, the internal dosimetry portion of them, to make sure that we're fair and balanced across all of the dose reconstructions that we do. And disclaimer, I am not a public spokesperson for the program. This is just my perspective as how we do things. So to start with the general overview, there's a good document by the NCRP when it's NCRP report 163. It's over 500 pages long. It talks about a lot of different aspects of dose reconstruction, pretty much from start to finish. I'll show a few concepts from that document before moving into more specific details. So that document defines these 4 categories of dose reconstruction, that being medical, occupational, environmental, and then accidents and incidents. Then to get into more specific details, the purpose of dose reconstruction and the focus of each of these purposes. So it might be an epidemiologic study. The focus on that is the accuracy of the dose. When you do an epi study, you want to assess the risk of cancer or other effects to the population that's exposed. And so to do some correlation, you want to have an accurate dose assessment versus what the end outcome is. In the case of intervention, a decision to be made for an accidental or malevolent exposure, you want something very quick. You don't have time to spend on an accurate dose assessment. You just need the magnitude of the dose to determine if something should be done right away. There's a lot of different instances involving accidental exposures. It could be a worker. For example, there was a worker at Hanford in the 70s who had a column with americium on it explode, and he had shards of glass in him with americium, and so they needed to do a quick assessment to determine what they had to do to take care of him. It could be something like, you've probably all heard of incidents where somebody maybe finds an old source from, usually in a third world country, it seems to happen. Somebody will abandon some equipment, gets broken into. There was one where there was cesium in an old, I'm not sure what the piece of equipment was, but it had cesium. People opened it, it was glowing. They would paint the cesium on them. It got spread around. That's something like that you have to do very quickly, come up with a dose assessment, determine what you're going to do. Then there's for public information where you give a range of doses. You routinely see what the average background is in the United States. That's based on a range of doses, looking across the country, looking at natural background, medical exposures, those kinds of things, compiling that for a range of doses. And finally, there's a compensation program where the focus is not on the accuracy of the dose, but it's on the accuracy of the compensation decision. If you can do a quick, rough estimate of the dose and still be sure that you're on the correct side of compensation, then you don't need a more accurate dose assessment. So to get into dose compensation programs, the purpose, as I said, you want to be quick. So you want to provide timely. You also want it to be uniform. You want to have the same outcome. If two different people have similar profiles, you want to ensure that you're going to get the same outcome for them. And so the ultimate purpose is to provide compensation or medical care to the covered individuals who are suffering from some illness. So there are actually a few radiation dose compensation programs in the United States. There's the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, which is known as RECA, that covers above ground weapons testing. It covers people who are traditionally called the downwinders, who live downwind from the testing that was done at the Nevada test site. It also includes uranium miners and millers. That program does not require a dose assessment. It's based on presumptive information, where the person was when they were there. And again, so no dose reconstruction done for that. There's the Nuclear Test Personnel Review, which is the Atomic Veterans Compensation, and that applies to veterans who were in the area of weapons testing that was done. There is some dose reconstruction down there. There's not bioassay for those people. So for the internal dose portion, it's based on knowledge of fallout and location and times. Then we get to the Energy Employee Occupational Illness Compensation Program, known as EEOICPA, or sometimes pronounced as EOICPA. That covers people at DOE facilities and its predecessors. So the predecessors being Atomic Energy Commission and the AEC, and ERDA was there for a while. So, well, I guess that was NRC, but anything prior to DOE, and I'll just refer to DOE when talking about this, but it applies back to the 40s when the whole weapons complex started. So in this one, we do actually calculate doses, although they relied on the Nuclear Test Personnel program to start as the basis for developing this one. So when looking at a compensation program, it differs quite a bit from an occupational program. In an occupational setting, you're focused on the safety of the workers. You're trying to protect them. You're proactively working, and then demonstrating compliance with the regulation. In a compensation program, it's already all passed. You know, the person has worked, has been exposed, and now they've developed a cancer that you're going to look at the dose that was incurred up to the date that the cancer was diagnosed. So the focus is on providing defensible dose calculations, looking back at what has already been done as far as monitoring and possible exposure. And so the outcome is a yes or no answer, rather than a specific dose that you're looking at. So the act was passed in 2000 by Congress, and it established a compensation program for individuals who worked basically in the production of nuclear weapons and testing at DOE and its predecessor agencies. I won't go through all of this, but the general basis for the program was that Congress determined that there was a unique set of dangers associated with the development of nuclear weapons, that there had been some secrecy involved in that development as far as telling people what they may have been exposed to, that there were unique dangers associated with this development, and that there were previously secret records that were found or came to light that showed that there were unmonitored exposures to individuals to both radiation and beryllium. So there is a part of the program that covers beryllium workers. I won't talk about that as part of this, but that is another portion of it. One other issue for this program was the fact that DOE was both the regulator and the contractor. So they were self-regulating it and still are for the most part, although there's more agencies put in place now for oversight of DOE to make sure that they're following the regulations. So just as an example of, to show that some people really did get pretty high exposures, there's a lot of different documents. I just pulled this one out to show how high things might have been at times. And this does go all the way back to the 40s. This was a report from Los Alamos, and it talks about people mouth pipetting. It's recommending that they wear PCs. So, it's recommending that they wear anti-contamination clothing, rubber gloves, use respirators. So that means maybe they weren't necessarily using them when they were working with material. And you see at the bottom here, says the men are getting about 0.5 or 0.6 hours a day. So that's pretty significant exposures by today's standards. So there's 3 rules that were put into place that govern this dose reconstruction. It's 42 CFRs, part 81, 82, and 83. So I won't go through all the details, but it just kind of outlines who's covered, how you should go about doing the dose reconstruction. And then the last one is for designating special classes, which I will talk a little bit more about in a while. So the general basics, a person who makes a claim has to have a radiation-related cancer, although that's really not an accurate statement. That the Act says that, but it classifies 22 radiogenic cancers that in some cases are compensated without doing a dose reconstruction. But then pretty much any cancer that a person incurs can be used as the basis of a claim. So no matter what cancer a person develops, they can file a claim, whether or not it's considered radiogenic. It just requires a dose reconstruction and then a probability assessment. This involves several departments of the government. It's administered by the Department of Labor. The analytical support is in NIOSH, which is part of the CDC, which is Health and Human Services. And then the information is supplied by the Department of Energy. So all of these departments have to work together for this program to come together. It covers workers who were at DOE sites or atomic weapons employers, which I'll get to in a moment. The claimant can be the actual employee, or if they are deceased, then it can be a survivor or group of survivors, which could include parents, grandparents, children, grandchildren. And the claimant has to establish their employment and their cancer. So they have to submit paperwork documenting all of this. Excuse me. So the covered facility types, there's the Department of Energy owned facilities. Those are generally the national laboratories and uranium enrichment plants. There are a few other smaller sites, which I'll actually mention one in a few minutes. So those are the big ones that most people know. There are then a whole bunch of atomic weapons employers, and those are companies that were not directly under the oversight of DOE, but they're private companies that had some kind of contract with DOE, and they performed work at their facilities, and work on weapons-related material. So these are often pretty small shops. Some of them were like steel mills that rolled steel, and then in their downtime, they would actually roll uranium for transfer back to a DOE facility. So there's less oversight there, less monitoring, less information in general. And because of these AWEs, there are actually around 300 covered facilities in the country. So just to give you examples, I looked up the covered facilities for Maryland and Virginia because I believe that's the area that the site covers. There weren't any in DC, but I found 5 covered facilities between the 3 states. Some of them are very limited. They're almost all AWEs, so some of the smaller or more limited applications or limited time frame or limited amount of work that they did. So in Maryland, in Baltimore, there's Armco Rustless Iron and Steel. They're only a covered facility for 1948. So a person would have had to have worked there in 1948 to be covered. They actually were one of the companies that did some rolling of uranium for the AEC. So apparently they did a one-time test. So it was probably just a couple of days, but the entire year of 1948 is covered. W.R. Grace in Curtis Bay is an AWE. It's covered from 1955 to 1958. We then also have something called residual radiation. So what that means is that the contract period ended with DOE, but because they had worked with radioactive material there, there's still contamination. So this was not initially covered as part of this compensation program, but there were some I think petitions, some discussion, people saying that, well, they were still being exposed even if the work was no longer being done. So in that time frame, even if the company is still doing radioactive work, but not under DOE, we look at only what could possibly be there left over from what was done when it was under the direction of DOE. And so this has a residual radiation period all the way up to 2011. So they processed radioactive materials under a contract with AEC to extract thorium and rare earths. So that was their focus, was thorium. And they operated until spring of 1957, and then the AEC terminated their contract in early 1958. So I think that's it for Maryland. Then Virginia had 3. The last one has a long list of what they did, so they have their own page. So the DOE facility, it's the Thomas Jefferson National Accelerator Facility in Newport News. That's under the direct control of DOE. So as long as it's operating, it's a covered facility. I should mention there's no end to this program. When it was enacted, it was just anybody who worked at a DOE facility. And so since they're still operating, anybody who goes to work there now would still be a potential claimant if they eventually develop the cancer. So the accelerator is an accelerator. They do research there. The University of Virginia at Charlottesville was an AWE from 1942 to 1944. And then they had residual radiation from 1970 to 1985. So they were involved with centrifuge technology very early on. 1942 was very early in this. So apparently records were found that showed that they got uranium fluoride from Harshaw, and they did some research with that. The uranium was not used, and so things ended in 1944. Then centrifuge work started again in mid-1950, but it didn't involve the production of nuclear materials, so it's not covered during that time frame. And I'm guessing they added that. These descriptions are listed from the DOE website that talks about the covered facilities, and I'm guessing that they had to add that because people were probably asking about centrifuge work in the 50s and why it wasn't covered. So the big one is BWXT in Lynchburg. That was an AWE in 1959, and so it's got random years, 1968 to 72, and then 1985 to 2001. And then it had several different residual radiation periods. So they participated early on in an oxide pellet fabrication program. They recovered highly enriched uranium from scrap for Y12. And they also were involved in Project Sapphire, which was where several people went to Kazakhstan to recover material from there to downblend the enriched uranium. So that's the covered facilities in your area. So there's two possibilities for compensation. The first one is by special exposure cohort, and that's a presumptive compensation. So that means no dose reconstruction is done. It's based on specific employment at specific times, and it's based on one of the 22 cancers that I mentioned earlier that are considered to be radiogenic. And I'll give a little more detail about that in a moment. Then the other possibility is at least as likely as not. And those quotes are actually in the rule and in the rule that specifies these. And every time it's mentioned, it's in quotes. So the original act established 4 SCCs, and that's the gaseous diffusion plants, which are in Kentucky, Ohio, and Tennessee, and then Amchitka Island, which was involved with a few nuclear underground tests. And so people meeting specific conditions are automatically compensated from those. It also established a process to approve additional cohorts. So in order to meet the conditions for an SDC for the initial ones, employment at the gaseous diffusion plants had to be 250 workdays prior to 1992. 250 workdays approximates a year of employment. They specified that it covered people who were monitored for external exposure, but then they later added, or should have been, which pretty much covers everybody, because the argument is always, well, everybody should have been monitored. And they have to have developed an eligible cancer after the start of employment. For Amchitka, they couldn't impose the minimum work time because it was just specific to a few nuclear weapons tests. So it's just employment prior to 1974 and exposed to radiation and the performance of the duties of those 3 nuclear tests. So there are 2 ways where a new special exposure cohort can be added, and that's 2 different forms. Either a petition can be initiated by an employee or a survivor, or maybe a union representative, somebody who's representative of some group on the site. And they have to compile certain information and say why they think that basically a dose reconstruction can't be done, that we can't adequately model the dose, and that there was some harm to these people, and so they should automatically qualify. The other way that they can be added is by our team can say, we can't do a dose reconstruction for this particular set of circumstances. And so that's another way where an SDC gets established. For the at least as likely as not possibility, which is what we primarily work on the team that I'm on, a person files a claim with the Department of Labor. Their employment and their cancer are verified, and so the cancer is classified as far as what organ or what specifically the cancer type is. The claim gets forwarded to NIOSH, and then they perform the dose assessment, which is our team will do the dose assessment, and the dose goes back to the Department of Labor. And then the Department of Labor determines if that dose gives a greater than or equal to 50% probability that the cancer was caused by a radiation dose in the performance of duty. So the compensation can consist of $150,000. That's the total for one employee. So if the claimants are survivors, regardless of the number of survivors, they split that $150,000 among them. It includes if the claimant is the employee, then they would also get medical expenses for the specific cancer, starting from the date that they filed the claim. And again, the decision is made by the Department of Labor. It considers the dose assessments that we do, but we don't make the final decision. So that when the probability of causation is run, it's to the dose to the organ of interest, which is where the cancer would have originated. It's based on National Cancer Institute risk models. The factors include the type of radiation to which the person was exposed, the dose distribution, which means we have to look at annual doses for internal dose, well, annual doses for all of them, but it's only the dose that is received up until the date of diagnosis. So we don't look at committed or effective doses, it's annual organ doses. The age at exposure and the age at diagnosis factor in, and there are some other influences depending on the cancer. So for lung cancer, they actually take into account smoking history. The claimant has to fill out a form where they check off, some range of smoking history, or whether they never smoked or they're a past smoker. And ethnicity is taken into account for skin cancers because there's different, very different baseline cancers depending on what skin type you have. Because the baseline is factored into the risk that the cancer actually came about from radiation exposure. And the software used to do this is called Interactive Radio-Epidemiological Program, or IREP, and that is available to the public online. So you can go and play around with it, put in doses and see what the probability is of a particular cancer. So the requirements are that we use the current ICRP models, which doesn't necessarily match up with what DOE is doing. So when we started this project, it was in 2002. DOE was still using ICRP 30 at the time, but we were required to use ICRP 68 forward. So we can't use the doses that the site has assessed. We have to take the bioassay results and do an assessment because we, over the history of it, there was ICRP 2, ICRP 30, all the different models. So we start with the bioassay, calculate the intake, calculate the doses. Besides the models being different, again, we have to look at annual organ dose, which is not what the site would be calculating. We're also required to be favorable to the claimant, meaning that whenever there's any unknown information, the benefit of the doubt goes to the claimant. The intent is to ensure that no one who deserves compensation is denied, which means the goal is a false negative rate of 0. So we'd like to minimize the false positive rate, but it's set up to ensure that the false negative rate is 0 and then accept whatever the false positive rate is based on that. So the dosimetry under this program actually comprises all four of the categories that I mentioned very early on. We look at occupational dose, any accidents or incidents that the person was in, medical dose, and environmental. So external dose and internal dose is included on the occupational side. I'll talk about missed dose more in a moment. Dose from work required medical screening. So if a person was required to have annual x-rays, for example, which was common at a number of sites, then that dose also gets included in this dose reconstruction. And environmental dose. So say if the person's outside, on the grounds of the facility, but not in the building, then we also have models for determining what the environmental dose might be. So as you might imagine, this required a massive data collection effort that's ongoing. It has been for 20 years now. So for an individual claim, a request goes to the facility, if it's still operating, that the person worked at, asking for their monitoring data. So film badge, TLD, urine samples, body counts, anything that might be available. We get that information directly from the sites. We also make a lot of site visits. So those have kind of slowed down. They came to a stop during the pandemic. I think they're just trying to start up again. We make data requests to the records groups at the different facilities. We do searches at federal record centers and internet searches. There's a lot of information out there just generally on the internet. So besides the individual data that's used, we need some context in which to interpret those, especially for bioassay. You need some idea of when an exposure might have happened. If you have a gross alpha result, you need to know what specific nuclides that might include. So each large site has a technical basis document. So the major DOE facilities, we have these massive documents that include all these different things, different chapters, to give the dose reconstructor information about how to interpret things. All of the documents that we write are on the CDC website, the Division of Compensation and Analytical Support. So it's the DCIS website, and I'll show that at the end, but any of these documents are available for people to view. So for internal dose specifically, well, when you do a dose assessment, you need to know dates of intake, you need to know what the nuclide is, and you need to know the material form. So when you have an intake, if it's an inhalation, it goes to the lung and it may behave one of a few different ways in the lung, which influences what the eventual dose is, especially if you're looking at different organs. So if you have a lung cancer and it's something that's retained for a long time in the lung, you're going to get a pretty large dose. But if you're looking at, the kidney dose and it's sitting in the lung, you'll get less dose to the kidney relative to what it would be in the lung. So it varies quite a bit depending on what the specific organ of interest is. Then you need some kind of monitoring data to do your intake. And as I mentioned, this is challenging under the best of circumstances. We can't measure internal dose directly, so we need to take these data that we have and then do some kind of modeling. And it's not traditional occupational internal dose. I already mentioned that this is different than an occupational program. The dose assessment is also very different. The objective of dose reconstruction for compensation is to estimate the dose that actually contributes to the risk of the cancer having developed from the intake of radionuclides. We have to use current ICRP models. So ICRP recently finished issuing a whole new set of models, starting with a new lung model of ICRP 130, and then addressing all the nuclides. We are going to have to shift everything to there. So any case that was non-compensable in the past may need to be done again. If it looks like the doses may increase based on the new models, then we'll have to go back and redo them to see if the person would now get compensated. As I mentioned a few times, we have to look at the annual organ dose through the date of diagnosis. When in an occupational program, you would be assessing the committed effective dose. And so those are very different values. The most exposed organ is not necessarily important. So where an occupational program would be looking at the 15-gram limit overall, then that doesn't matter to us. It's whatever organ has cancer in it that we would be assessing the dose to. A lot of these are not specifically modeled. For example, the prostate, that's a very common cancer, but there's not a direct ICRP model for assessing that. So we have to come up with ways around that. Missed dose must be included. Again, I think that's the next slide. And uncertainty is included. So when these doses go into IREF, they go in with a distribution. It might be a log normal distribution. It might be a triangular. There's a number of options. We don't use all of them. There's something called the log triangular distribution in IREF. There's several. We typically stick with log normal, constant, and triangular when inputting internal dose. So missed dose. That is the dose that could go undetected based on the limitations of your bioassay program when we're talking about internal dose. external dose is also required to assess a missed dose. So in that case, it's more straightforward. If your lower limit of detection on a TLD is 10 milligram, you can't say that if it was less than 10 milligrams, it's 0, because there's some probability or possibility that the person had some amount of dose between 0 and that value. So we have to assign something. So similarly, for a bioassay, when you have results less than the detection limits, then we have to do some kind of assessment to determine what that dose might have been. So what we do for internal dose is we assume that it's pretty linear between 0 and whatever the intake would have been at the MDA for the bioassay results. And the dose gets entered in as a triangular distribution, with the minimum dose being 0, the maximum dose being what you would assess if the value of the bioassay was equal to the MDA, and the mode is the intake that would result, or the dose that would come about from half of the MDA. And so that has to be calculated for, that's the majority of doses that we calculate. Most of the bioassay results, there's nothing detected in them, but then we still have to go through this whole assessment and assign this dose and enter that into the probability software. So some of the challenges: there's limited information on work location of individuals or their potential for intake. I mentioned earlier that the probability software requires doses in terms of radiation type. So it's based on W sub R. So it might be alpha, beta. There's some different ranges of gamma that are input, or different ranges of beta. Well, for internal dose, we have to do our assessments based on a specific nuclide. So once we have that intake, we have to convert that to a radiation type to be able to enter it in. And again, so the organ that we're looking at is not necessarily what was of interest to the site. Additional challenges are we can't ask follow-up samples. This is all in the past. We get what we get and have to use that. We might not have all the information that we need about the areas, the materials, or the bioassay and how to interpret it. Might be difficult to retrieve. A lot of the samples are analyzed with old technology, so there's a lot more uncertainty, and a lot of them are gross activities. So we have a gross alpha measurement, a gross beta measurement, or gross gamma, and we have to come up with a specific nuclide or group of nuclides to actually do the assessment, which is unfortunate, since we then have to turn it back into alpha, beta, or gamma, but we can't do an intake assessment on an alpha, beta, or gamma. In a lot of cases at uranium facilities, they did mass measurements of the uranium. You need activity to be able to do an intake assessment. And there's a lot of variability between different enrichments of uranium. Depleted uranium has a low specific activity relative to highly enriched, which has a very high specific activity. So depending on your assumption, you could get very large differences in what the activity would be. So organ doses are difficult to work with. If you have worked in internal dosimetry, you kind of have a feel for what intakes produce what kind of doses. None of that works when you're looking at annual organ doses and what might be the most clinically favorable thing to assume. So, in some ways, it's easier if you don't have a strong background in internal dosimetry, because your intuition throws you off sometimes. We've had a number of special internal dosimetry issues that have come up during this program. The first one is recycled uranium, which comes about starting in 1952. A lot of the uranium was previously used. We've gone through a reactor, was recovered from there. And so there are impurities mixed in with the recycled uranium. And I've mentioned this before. again, this is my personal opinion, but I think this might be one of the reasons that this whole program started, because a number of years ago at one of the gas distribution plants, somehow it became known that they were using recycled uranium and there were contaminants in it. There was neptunium, plutonium, very small amounts, but still, mixed in with the uranium. And the people felt like they had not been told, the workers were not told that that was mixed in, and they were not being monitored separately for those nuclides. There was a whole big, I don't know if it was a lawsuit, but there was some concern expressed and investigations. And I think this might be where the secret documents, previously secret documents came in, that again, secrecy, that people weren't aware of this. There's not large doses coming from this, but there was a lack of communication with the workers. So again, my opinion, I think that's part of the basis for this whole program. Then there's mixed fission and activation products. You monitor for cesium or cobalt, but there's a lot of other things that could be mixed in. We have to account for all of those. We have to try and come up with some ratios to determine what needs to be added in based on what's actually measured. Plutonium, there's weapons grade and fuel grade plutonium that have different mixtures that include americium and other things. Then there are some unusual forms of uranium. There's super S plutonium-239, which means it's retained more strongly in the lung than the standard type S material, or type class Y, which would be an ICRP-30 system. So we had to develop a model to assess super S material because it has been identified at some sites. But the ICRP doesn't currently have a model for it. And there's also ceramic plutonium-238, a similar situation, where facilities that made the SNAP generators, they generate electricity for satellites. It's a very hard ceramic that does not behave the same way as standard model. So we had to come up with a model for that also. And then there's also stable metal tritides, which is where tritium binds to some other metal. Uranium is common. There's a lot of different ones, and they're retained in the lung when HTO would not be bound there. So that requires a different model. So again, just reiterating that our charge is to have a sufficiently accurate assessment of the compensation decision, not of the dose. So we make a lot of simplifying assumptions where we can. Because of things I've mentioned already, we don't necessarily have all of their employment history, and we do have to address their entire employment history. So that could be lengthy at times. We have limited time to research each case. We have thousands of cases, and we want to be timely, and we don't always have complete details of exposure. So there are a couple of general methods. An underestimate could be done. So if a person has a cancer that's very radiogenic, that might require only a little dose, then it's possible that an underestimate would push the probability over 50%. And there's no point in assessing anything further because you're only going to increase your dose and increase your probability. So if the person was involved in an incident, for example, it might be that assigning the dose just from that incident pushes them over the 50% range. For internal dose, the one that's most commonly used, that underestimates are used for, would be lung, because especially if the person was a never smoker, it doesn't take a lot of dose then to get the probability in the compensation range. So underestimates are always very case specific. It's dependent on what monitoring the person has, what potential they might have had. An overestimate is a lot more common. There are some cancers that it takes a fair bit of dose because they're not radiogenic. Prostate cancer is one of them. There's, again, anything that's not normally radiogenic, then you can assign an overestimate And the probability is much less than 50%. And so you don't have to fine tune it because anything else, you'd just be reducing the dose. Our best estimate is required when we get in the ballpark of 50% probability. They get increased scrutiny, they get additional peer reviews. Everything gets a peer review, but there are multiple peer reviews when you get in this range. It has to be based on individual monitoring, and no over or underestimates are allowed. And those can take a lot of time, which is why we try to avoid them when possible. Excuse me. So one method we use, I mentioned that we had to assign dose, unmonitored dose. Well, I don't think I specifically mentioned it, but it was on the slides. So there are some cases where you think that a person might have had a potential for exposure, but they weren't monitored. So at several sites, we have databases. The sites have been required to maintain their bioassay results. We have gotten copies of these databases, or we get hard copies and we actually create the database ourselves. And then we compile that information and do what we call a co-exposure study. And so we come up with a distribution, a log normal distribution for the most part, and assign that to people who have little or no monitoring data, but it looks like they might have had the potential for intakes. And this is done with the assumption that people who are monitored are representative of the people who were not monitored, that they were working in similar jobs, similar areas. And so we can assign that dose to the people. So this is just an example of what some of the data look like. This is from Fernald. It's uranium bioassay results. So what we do is take the bioassay results, typically for a year, and do a statistical analysis of them and come up with a single data point. So each of these, that's a compilation of all of the results for all of the people who were monitored on site for that year. Unfortunately, the software we use doesn't print out dates, it prints out days. So this is probably around 1952, 53, and then it goes forward from there. And we would do a fit using internal dose software. We use IMBA, and this would tell us what the intakes were for each of these years. So we model the 50th and 84th percentile. That allows us to get the geometric mean, and then we also assign a geometric standard deviation. So that's based on the 50th and 84th percentile. And this is just a quick table of what you see from it. So that's the fitting of all of these. This is the result of it. This is the intakes that come about from that previous graph. So that was 1952, the first data point. And so if you had a person who was not monitored, but you thought that they had some potential for intake, then you would assign, well, this is the activities. So we'd assign 93.3 picocuries per day of type F uranium for this time frame. So we do have a hierarchy of data sources that we follow. Individual monitoring is obviously the best set of data that you have for a person, so that is used first. And then we move down. Indicator radionuclides, I mentioned fission and activation products. We have a document that we have that gives ratios of fission and activation products to strontium or cesium. So if we have values for either of those, we can come up with an intake and then ratio the rest of the nuclides to that. Then, coworker monitoring, workplace monitoring. Workplace monitoring is kind of frowned on to use for assessment, but at the AWVs, that's typically all that's available. So we use that pretty heavily for those, but not for the DOE facilities. So wrapping up this part of the talk, these are the statistics as of September 25th of this year. There have been over 37,000 cases that have had dose reconstruction and went all the way through Department of Labor to a final decision. And you can see that about a third of them exceeded the 50% probability, and 2/3 of them were less than the 50% probability. So that has pretty much held for the whole 20 years we've been doing this. I looked back 10 or 12 years, and it was still running at a third, 2/3 for the compensation split. So here are just some references if you're interested in anything else in more detail. The report that I mentioned at the start, NCRP 163, there is an entire health physics journal devoted to this program. I don't remember now, it's volume 95. It's been several years ago now, so we've been evolving over time, so we may do things a little bit differently, but that covers the basics of all the different parts, all the aspects of the program. And as I mentioned, there's the IREP probability software, and well, pretty much all of this information can be found on the NIOSH website. Like I said, all the technical documents that we write, they're all available there. So that ends my technical discussion. I would like just a few minutes to talk about the Health Physics Society and my role as president-elect and subsequently president. So first, I just wanted to give you an overview. I've been very involved with the Health Physics Society for a number of years. I was involved, we moved around a little bit. I was involved with several different chapters. I've served in positions at, for each of the ones I was involved with. And then at the national level, I've had a number of different positions on a few different committees and on the board of directors. So I hope I can bring that experience to help strengthen the Health Physics Society. Let's see what my next, I encourage you, if you're not a member of the National Society, I encourage you to join. There are a number of benefits. You can go to the website to see what they are. I think now an increased benefit because of COVID is the access to virtual meetings. So, you know, we've made a good transition to virtual meetings. It's nice to meet in person. Certainly you can't beat that. You know, interacting with people directly is really helpful. But I think having these hybrid meetings with the National Society are very helpful. You know, a number of people can't travel, which is the reason that many people have given for not joining National, that if they can't go to the meetings, then they don't see a benefit in joining. But now that everyone has access to virtual meetings, it's a lot easier to join. We have been doing some free webinars. There was a really good one last week or the week before on, well, I think it was good because it was internal dosimetry. It was dose reconstruction to the radium dial painters. And joining virtually is also very helpful. I went to the annual meeting in Spokane in July, but I ended up getting sick. Turned out to be COVID, unfortunately, and I got sick the first day of the meeting. So I spent all day Tuesday in my hotel room watching the meetings online. I didn't go to the session. So other benefits of joining the National Society is you get any ANSI publications that are done through the Health Physics Society. There are free to members. There are free or discounted NCRP publications, and there's the HP Journal and newsletter. As far as my focus as president of the society, because I've had a lot of experience with the society, interacting with a lot of different people and with the secretariat, I would like to focus on the operations, the internal dealings of the society. I think during the pandemic, we did gain the value of virtual meetings, but I think things have, you know, come a little bit separated with people not being able to meet in person. A number of the local chapters are faltering now. You guys are doing great. A number of them have not met in a couple of years now. And so I think we need to kind of get things on a better track so that we can make sure that things don't fall apart over time. Maybe gain some members back, because we've been losing members for years, even before the pandemic. And I would love to hear from any of you, whether you're a member of the National Society or not. If you're not, maybe tell me why you're not, and what could, if anything, could be changed to make you change your mind. So please feel free to email me. My address is here, and I'd love to hear from you and take any questions that anybody has now, if you have any. Brett.
Hi, Liz. Thank you very much for this presentation. I'm currently at Sandia National Laboratories in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and I have a slew of questions. So my first question is, how many questions am I allowed to ask?
It doesn't matter to me.
All right. So one of the things that resonated for me through this presentation and from previous, I'll just say rumblings about NIOSH, is this whole idea that you all take the bioassay results despite the dose assessment and reconstruct your own doses, which thank you for teaching us that it's because of the annual organ doses for the organ that was affected. That's why. So let's say people are monitored for plutonium, and they're monitored out of convenience, like a coverall. Does it, if a worker is on plutonium monitoring, does the missed dose differ for someone who's on an annual frequency versus a semi-annual? And if there's no documented work associated with the plutonium, but the worker is monitored for it, do you take that into consideration?
There is some amount of professional judgment that's allowed. So, although probably more likely in modern times, if we go back to historical times, then if somebody were monitored, we would probably just make the assumption that they had the potential for exposure. But the dose reconstructor looks at the person's job title. Depends on the site, how much information we have. If we know, where particular work was done, all that is based, it's all dose reconstructor judgment. And we assign people to work on a facility so that they're not just jumping around from one to another, so that they hopefully get a feel for what kinds of things they see at a particular location. So we do rely on the sites a lot, though. We try to get as much information as possible. We've gone back to them many times. Sandia is unfortunate. I can talk to you about that separately. We know that there's not a lot of potential for intakes there, but we have run into issues. So we have an oversight group. There's the Presidential Advisory Board, and they have their own subcontractors who review things, and they're a little more anti-nuclear than what, I don't say we're not pro-nuclear. We try to do the best science that we can, but they have people who are kind of advocating for the claimants and trying to say, well, you don't really know this, and so you have to assign these doses. So it gets very political. And so a lot of what we do is based on politics rather than science. That's the bottom line. That's the reality of it. So.
Okay, so you all do take professional judgment and work scope into consideration, not just the fact that, oh, this person was randomly monitored for such and such nuclide.
Yes.
Okay. Another question. What guidance do you have for dosimetry programs to make your all jobs easier? And this does include how records are handled.
So it's helpful to have documentation of why a person was monitored. If it's just for convenience or if they have a potential for intake, how you determine who gets on the program and why they're on the program. That's really very important. And that those records get to us. Some sites might have that, but it might not be associated with an individual, so we might not see it. But any information, as much detail as possible about why a person was monitored, I think is the most important thing.
Okay. So like in the technical basis documentation, put that in. Okay. And then the last thing, do you foresee the Health Physics Society supporting any trainings, especially for internal and external dosimetrists? And I say this with the understanding that MJW does provide an internal dosimetry training, and there is an external dosimetry training associated with Joe Rotunda.
So MJW, we're not doing a lot of training right now, but well, so next year's professional development school is going to be on internal dosimetry in July, in conjunction with the meeting that's at the Baltimore, Washington is hosting. It'll be in National Harbor in July, and concurrent with that, or I think Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday of that, there will be an internal dosimetry school. Well, and Gus Potter and Tom Malone will be teaching it. So that way. So we are doing more webinars with the Health Physics Society, so that might be something that we're doing. That actually came up on a call today that's about internal dosimetry, so that might be something that we can look at doing.
Okay, thank you for fielding all my questions.
You're welcome.
Bill Beal has had his hand up.
Yeah.
Hi, thank you. This is Bill. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Thanks. So I really enjoyed the talk. I work in the emergency response world, so it's really interesting to hear, a completely different, a completely different realm, basically, where, we never even have to give anybody our error bars. And so given that compensation is involved and legalities, and I imagine it can be pretty contentious a lot of times, and I'm curious, and forgive me if this question is naive for the folks who work in the field, but I'm curious if granted there's several assumptions that have to be made and things like that, but when you're doing dose reconstruction, what are the claimant's options for like getting a second opinion, if you will? Is the process just too rigid given the set of assumptions that you have, or is there cases where someone else has to do a separate assessment, or how? I'm curious how all that might work.
It's not so much a separate assessment, but if the claimant feels that something was missed or done incorrectly, then they do have recourse to file. And I can't remember what it's called. There's some form that they can file, but they do have to have a specific reason. They can't just say they don't like the decision. But if they feel something, if they have additional information, or think something was not done correctly, then they can pursue that. I'm not involved in that part of it, so I don't know all the details of how it works. But there's some.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. And like I said, so with the new models coming out, and anytime new information comes out and we change the way we're doing something, if it would result in an increase in dose, then we have to go back and we reassess anything that was not compensable previously to see if it would now become compensable. But the converse is not true. If a dose goes down because of some new finding, new information, or new model, we would not go back and reassess, something that was compensable. That would never happen. So.
Actually, if you don't mind, then I since you mentioned it, I have a follow-up question. Then with the the current, what's the status? You I think alluded to it a bit, that things are sort of in the process of moving up to the 103, 130 dosimetry models. In our world, the emergency response world, we've at least moved to 60. The 60 models, but we haven't been able to move further because there's certain, dose coefficients and things, and the DCF pack software hasn't been updated with all the dose coefficients that we need and things like that. Is it a
Right.
similar? Is it a
Yes.
similar thing for your
Yeah,
world?
and it's more complicated for us since we have to do annual organ doses. You can't buy off-the-shelf software that does annual organ doses. So my guess is it's a couple of years before we can implement the new models. We've just started talking about software, whether we want to develop our own We're, we're talking about starting with something that ORNL developed and building like a shell for it, but it is a little way off before we can start using, implementing those models. Any other questions? Well, thank you all very much for having me, and I look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, Liz. That was a tour de force. In my first job, there were a parallel group was doing the DITRA dose reconstruction, and I remember sitting down and having this explained to me a different way once. So it's neat to kind of come back.
Yeah, there's a lot of similarities with
Top to
that.
bottom. But thank you very much for taking the time, and everyone. Thank you for coming out and participating. I know for Liz, that's a long time to talk to your computer. So
Yeah.
I mean, I hope we can do this where we see each other's faces sometime soon. But I appreciate it, everyone. We'll get something to you soon, but mark your calendars. November 29th will be our next technical meeting. We've actually gotten Frank von Hippel, who has a long career in nuclear security and non-proliferation, to kind of talk about weapons and power reactor security in light of everything that's transpired in Ukraine. So that'll be our next technical program. So stay tuned for that. But thank you again, Liz, and have a good night, everyone.